Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to a new study, a new week of studies. Obviously, not a new study because we're continuing to look at 1 Samuel chapter 18. And we sort of finished off the chapter, but there's still things we have to look at, like we've read it all. But anyway, before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Dear gracious Heavenly Father, we invite your presence into our midst as we open your word and as we seek your presence in our lives this week. We're thankful for the past week, the past Sabbath, and the blessings that we received. And we just ask, Lord, that this week will be a blessing as well, and that we can learn to obey your voice and not to trust in self. Give us wisdom and understanding in applying the lessons from 1 Samuel, the story of David and Saul, to our time, and that we may know our present duty. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Good morning again, everyone. So what we were looking at yesterday, well, it doesn't really show. Let me see, where we had gone back a little bit and asked a question about the javelins. That was the last thing that we had talked about. And I had asked where we could place the javelins. Let me see, where is this? I don't see it. Yeah, it should be verse 10. That's 10 and 11, so way back here. So we had talked about these javelins, and this was the thing that, I wouldn't say bothered me, but thing that I was puzzling about is that it talks about this javelin and that David is going to avoid this javelin twice, right? That it says in the King James, David avoided out of his presence twice, but the idea is that he avoided the javelin twice, is what I understand. And now the question is that twice that day? Is this talking about two different times that Saul tried to spear him with the javelin, with the spear? So the question that we have regarding Saul's attack against David is we have this word twice, and then I asked about putting it on a line. Now, so we use these symbols from the Hebrew numbers in Strong's Concordance, and we noted that the word javelin or spear is 2595. Now, the thing is, that reminds me of the number 2592, which is, there's 25,920 parts in a Hebrew day. That is a day which we have 86,400 seconds in a day. Is that how many seconds we have? Right?
Right.
Okay. But the Hebrews don't use seconds. They use these things called a helic. So they would be helikim, right? And each of those are 3 1/3 seconds in length. So more like what we would call a moment. At least I was taught that a moment is about 3 to 5 seconds, but I don't know if that's true or not. But so
it sounds like a moment.
yeah, just a moment, just a few seconds, basically. Yeah, so they have 1,440 minutes and 86,400 seconds in a day, but the Hebrews have 25,920 helic. Now, of course, the interesting thing about that is that relates to the molad interval, or the molad moment. That is the length of a month, that is the average lunar month. That is kind of redundant, but a month based upon the moon, instead of just a month of, like we have a month of 30.44 days on average. But the actual lunar month is 29.530587 days in length. But in the Hebrew calculation, it's 765,432 plus 1 parts, right? So it's this interesting number. So I did a paper on it and so forth, which really interesting. Also, the fact is that was really interesting is that this 25920 parts in a Hebrew day is also the numbers of years in the precession of the equinoxes. And the question is, did they use that number, the precession of the equinoxes, to derive the number of parts in a day? And it's a question nobody really has asked before. So I examined that in that paper on the molad interval, but not going to go through all the details of that here. But anyway, when I see that number that's kind of close to it, it's three different, 259, instead of 2592, it's 2595. And then I think, well, is there any relationship, right? Then also we can take that Hebrew number 2595 and say, well, what if it was a period of time? So 2595 divided by 365 1/4 gives us, I multiplied it, 2595 divided by 365 1/4, it's better, gives us 7 years and I think it was 28 days or something like that. You can find it out. 38 days, 7 years and 38 days. So, the question was, is there a 7-year period plus 38 days that exists in our line that we could mark that has something to do with David avoiding this spear, that is something to do with this message? And that was the question. And that's sort of where we finished off on Thursday. I don't have an answer to that. So I don't have a place where I could say, yeah, that's where we're going to place it. Now, we had looked at from 2012, December 21st. That's going to bring us to January 28th or 29th, 2019, I think. Let's see, 2020. So it didn't bring us to any date that I knew that was significant in and of itself. So then we we look at some of those clues and say, well, is there some place that this naturally falls in that we could use, right? And then we have to say, well, what is this spear? What is this javelin that has been avoided, right? Now, we also noted that the number twice has all of the digits of Capricorn's constant. So that seemed to be something that we needed to take a look at. So I'm just going to put this up on the screen so you can see the numbers I'm looking at. So we can see here, there's the Hebrew word javelin, right? That's 2595. Make that bigger there. And then when we look at this, he avoided out of his presence twice. That's 6471. Now, the number of occurrences in the King James of that number is 111 times, which is an interesting number. The first time it occurs in the Bible is Genesis. You see, Genesis. It's in Genesis, but which one? There's Genesis 2, verse 23. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones." Now, it's kind of interesting they translate that as the word now, but we know that it's also translated as the word twice. So the idea of this twice in the sense of now, it seems to be a type of repetition, right? Like when you look at the meaning of the word, Brown Driver Spriggs gives us pa'am, a stroke, a beat, a footstep, an anvil, an occurrence. So this is something that occurs, that is in time, stroke, beat. That's why it can be thrice, that is as time on time at this repetition, this once, now, and length. So the idea could be not that he just avoided out of his presence twice, right? That is that this happened repeatedly, right? That is, it happened more than once. It was a repetition. This is something that occurred, right? So that's why the word twice, it's like, well, is it like 2 times, or is this something that just repeatedly was happening? Now, of course, we see the number 6471, and that is Capricar's constants. Well, if you take the number 6471 and you go 7641 minus 1467, you'll get Capricar's constant, which is 6174. That is, if you take any 4 digits and you put them from highest to lowest and you subtract the from lowest to highest of those same digits, within 7 iterations, you will get Capricar's constant, and it will tend towards that to the point that you will get 6174. So obviously that isn't Capricar's constant 6471. It's not 6174, but it has the digits of it. And the idea of Capricar's constant is we came to understand that an iteration of numbers, that is having the numbers in different orders, can still represent that number. So the fact that Capricar's constant is not, that this is the numbers of Capricar's constant. And it has to do with this idea of something repeating, especially as time on time, as at this repetition, this once, now at length, right? So it's kind of an interesting symbol, right? So exactly what we would do with this, I don't know. Now, out of his presence literally is from his face. That is, we see the word panaim, face, 6440, and that 4480 is just actually a prefix to that, which is a mem in front of it, which means from. Right. So in Hebrew, it would just be one word, but they put 2 Hebrew numbers there to show that it says from his face. And then this idea of avoided, it's probably a pretty good translation of avoided, of the Hebrew word sabab, which means to turn about, right? Basically, to turn away from, so to be turned. So he avoided it, right? He turned away from it. So whether it's referring to him literally doing this, like that he's leaving the room or not, I'm not sure. It could be just that in front of Saul when this happened, he was able to avoid the spear. And Ellen White says that the Holy Spirit from God helped him to do this. And then we have this Saul being afraid. So we have 2 different types of afraids. One referring to more a type of awe or reverence in the recognition of God leading him. The other one is him sort of shrinking away from him, so that he's sort of paranoid. They're kind of 2 different afraids, obviously. So that one where it says in verse 15, wherefore when Saul saw that he had behaved himself wisely, he was afraid of him. That's the one, 1481, which means to dread, fear, stand in awe, be afraid. So that's the that one. And then the other afraid in verse 12. This is the one, let me see here, I'm doing this right. So this one here says to shrink, to fear. So it's this one, just to sojourn, abide, dwell in, dwell with, remain, inhabit. Just doesn't seem like it looks like afraid. Okay. Yeah, the Brown's Drivers Briggs gives quite a bit different impression than the Strong's. So with Strong's, I'll click on this here, just gotta wait a second. To turn aside from the road, the lodging or purpose, that is to sojourn, also to shrink in fear, as in a strange place. So kind of has some of the same meaning. Stand in awe can have that meaning. So we have the fear anyway 3 times. So I don't know what to do with that. I'd like to say the question was really, can we place this in our history as some events that a javelin is tossed at David. Now we're saying that David primarily is representative of a leadership that where God is the leader based on David's character. We know that in the story of David and Goliath, David was the champion that Saul chose, which we, in contrast to Goliath, so we looked at Goliath as being Parminder's groups. The date, November 9th, 2019, and July 18, 2020 being the date that FFA chose. And these two dates are sort of battling out, and July 18th, of course, is going to win. Now, once David defeats Goliath, Saul still is not happy. So the leadership of FFA has a type of disappointment, even though there's this victory over Parminder's movement. Any thoughts about any of this so far in this quick review?
Is the javelin an actual javelin? Literally a javelin?
In the story of Saul throwing it at David, yeah. It's a javelin. In our history, it would be symbolic.
Oh.
Right. Okay. So we're not looking at anybody throwing a javelin at anybody. But we do recognize that the idea, it's a spear, right?
Yeah, so pretty much.
Translated.
Thank you.
A spear most of the time. But the idea then is there were attacks in the movement. And I would say repeatedly against July 18, 2020 as a date. Now, I know you don't know much about it there, Zachary, but because it's all kind of new to you. But the type of attacks would be, we can use the idea of a spear being thrown as symbolizing an attack on a person rather than an idea. That is, ad hominem arguments, rumors, gossip, those types of things have been the weapons that FFA was using behind the scenes, secret meetings, all these types of things. And we went through some of that history a little bit last Thursday. And we spoke very plainly about it, which, some people don't like to do. Some people like to sort of couch their language in sort of code so that only the initiates sort of know what we're talking about. But I like to use people's names. I like to just be straightforward in plain. That's the way that I deal with things. So we looked at how Bronwyn had acted, Larry Lesher, Larry Hine, these different people had acted in regard to me personally, and to July 18th, even prior to the failure of the prediction that FFA had made using that date. Okay, so that's just kind of a review of that. I don't know if we have a good answer to it. Obviously, we'll come back to these things as time goes on, and then we may find that as we move ahead further, that these things will fall into place, because we are going to see where Saul actively decides to kill David. That's the next chapter. Now, then we have David marrying Michal, Saul's daughter. Now, so we're just going to read over this a little bit. Saul said to David, "Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul said, "Let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him." Now we're going to see later David does the same type of error as Saul when he puts Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba, who David got pregnant. He's going to put Uriah to the battle so that he would be killed, right? So this same thing was a plan that Saul had against David. And David said unto Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life, or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" Now, we haven't really dealt with the whole symbolism of this relationship, what this would mean, what Saul is promising David, why, right? I mean, we did read some spirit of prophecy statements about it, but the idea is that Saul feels that he can have control over David in some way. Saul's not really very rational in what he's doing. He seems sort of double-minded, a bit unstable emotionally. So we can't always make sense out of his reasoning. But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Maholathite, to wife. So even though he had promised Merab, he's going to marry her off to someone else. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain. So you're going to get one of my two daughters. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, Commune with David secretly, and say, Behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spake those words in the ears of David, and David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be the king's son-in-law, seeing that I'm a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spake David. So David's response is like, I'm not really important enough to be Saul's son-in-law. Now we know David knows he's anointed of God. So it's hard to know exactly what David's thinking here, but definitely he's not exalting himself. He allows God to exalt him. And Saul said, Thus shall ye say to David, the king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So he says, well, you have this dowry that you could pay, normally you'd pay a dowry, and that's partly why David says he's poor, right? I can't, really afford to marry the king's daughter. But it says, no, you just need to kill 100 Philistines. And the idea here is that Saul is hoping that David will be killed by the Philistines in doing that. So now when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. So we're going to have to look at that, what that means. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins and gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David. Saul became David's enemy continually. So we're going to have to look at that. There's a bunch of symbolism in there. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass, after they went forth, that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. So all of these things that Saul is doing to sort of get rid of David end up actually benefiting David as far as his status within Israel, which is going to be important when he actually becomes king.
So the current king is mad at the guy who killed 100 Philistines. He doesn't like him, but he gave.
So Saul had disobeyed God. He had acted as a priest, offering sacrifices, which it was forbidden for him to do.
Okay.
He's not following God. He's not able to be corrected. And God had anointed David some years before as king, and David, of course, knows that he was anointed as king. But David isn't seeking to exalt himself as king. He's leaving that in God's hands.
Mm.
But Saul knows that his time as king is short, though he's going to be king for 40 years. But the main thing is his kingdom will not go to his son Jonathan. But Jonathan doesn't want to be king. He recognizes that God is with David. And Jonathan's quite a bit older than David.
Interesting.
And, they have a good relationship. So the problem with Saul is his arrogance, his trust in self, and his lack of faith and confidence in God's leading, his unwillingness to obey God. And David is obedient to God, and he's patient, and he allows God, the time when he's going to become king, that will be in God's hands, not in his own hands. We're going to see this worked out in the story between Saul and David. So Saul is going to continue to want to kill David. David's going to become a fugitive. And David's going to have opportunity, if he wanted to kill Saul on 2 occasions. But he chooses not to put his hand against the Lord's anointed. And so allowing God to be in charge, David is behaving himself wisely. He's very prudent, wise. So he's not a rash, self-serving individual. But this is the thing that Saul hates. And so we see this type of thing worked out, this clash between the righteous and the wicked, where those that have a trust in God can be patient. Those that are trusting in themselves become rash, irrational, self-serving, and sort of their actions are self-defeating. So even the goals and ambitions that they have are undermined by their own actions. So that's what we see in the story of David and Saul. Now we're making an application of this story based upon the symbols that God has given us in this movement to apply this to our present situation and the situation over the last few years of what's happened in the movement. So, some of this Zachary, you wouldn't be familiar with any of this history of what's happened, so it might not make any sense. But, we have symbols, for instance, July 18, 2020 was this date that was given us by God to counter, that's a long, complicated story, but 1872, or the numbers 1872, even if they're in a different order, represent July 18. So we'll look at a verse like 1 Samuel 18:27. It has the 1-8, the 2, and the 7 from July 18:20. And so we look at that verse and we say, okay, here we have a verse. It has the symbol of July 18th, 2020. Is there anything about this that we could place at July 18th, 2020, about David killing 200 Philistines? Right now, he was only asked to kill 100. He's going to kill 200. And
I have a question about that really quick.
Yeah,
I'll make it brief. So first it was 100, now it's 200. Did he ever go past? I'm not it's horrible that people died, but it's a part of our book and our Holy Bible. Pardon me. And I was just wondering, did he ever go over that number? Was there people that were really, did he say was there just 100 there, or was there maybe more? And he said, okay, well, I was sent for 100, and you guys go away now, or.
Well, I don't know.
No, I
exactly what happened. It's just that he chose to kill 200, is what I would think.
Yeah.
So, he stopped at 200. I mean, could have kept killing Philistines, I guess, but that's what he killed. He killed 200 Philistines rather than just the 100 that was requested. So he gave a double portion, right? Now, and as evidence, he took their foreskins, right? Which is a common thing to do. And Angela notes that Ellen G. White's birth was in 1827, Miller's in 1782. They both have that symbol of 1872 in there. Okay, so I'm just looking at some of these Hebrew words. Now it says, and they gave them in full tale. That's one Hebrew word, right? So we got all of those words there, just Malay, that is to fill, or intransitively to be full in a wide application, right? So he brought all of these to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. Now, the 200, the symbols, so we have the symbols of, numbers are symbols. Now 200, of course, it's a doubling of the 100. Is there anything we could do with 200 as far as a symbol in our lives?
Well, if the 200 is a doubling, does that mean that David is beginning to understand the second angel's message?
Well, we could just put it at the second angel's message, being July 18th. That could be part of it. I mean, now when we look at David and understanding, what David represents, we know that this has to do with the movement being under the leadership of Christ, under Christ's leadership, because David is under Christ's leadership, where Saul's under his own leadership. We also say David represents July 18, 2020, at least in the story of Goliath, but he continues to seem to represent it. That now Jonathan, who loves David, Jonathan is a symbol of the chronology that supports David, that is, supports July 18. Now, I guess the question, though, is that Saul had these, in fighting against the Philistines, we look at the Philistines as, again, Parminder's methodology. So is it that July 18th went over and above what Saul's expectations were? And, then the question is Saul, in this instance, obviously this wouldn't be the same event, because we put November 9th as that battle. It's in connection more with November 9th than with July 18th when we look at the battle between Parminder's movement and ours as November 9th. This seems to more focus in this story on July 18th, right? That's how we've come to understand that. So that when the leadership of FFA, in a sense, they have their strategy of what they're trying to accomplish through accepting July 18th, but it becomes out of control, right? Everything that they are seeking to have accomplished, they keep trying to control it, and yet it ends up taking over, so to speak, right? I mean, because the question I still have is, why did Jeff choose July 18th? If we look at what Jeff's, I don't like to use the word ambition, but I can't think of a better word, for the movement, what he was expecting to happen. So he sees the movement fall apart. He says Parminder take the vast majority of the movement. And he could have, at that point, just said, we were wrong with Parminder. He brought in time setting. Time setting is wrong. And we're just going to, move on and recognize the mistake that we made, that Parminder was just a deceiver. And he doesn't need to have July 18th, 2020, right? He doesn't need that date. But Jeff adopts the date. Right? He's going to now promote this date, and he has lots of counsel not to. Like, there's lots of people who are asking Jeff, not to have anything to do with time setting. And Jeff is going to hear lots of things about me personally. I'm the one who came up with the date, July 18, 2020. And he knows that is something that he had heard constantly from Tabo, from Parminder, all of these stories. And from other people, who created stories. So the fact that Jeff picks up July 18, 2020 and begins to promote it just seems kind of strange. Now I'm attached to it, of course, right? Because I'm the one who came up with that date in response to Parminder's time setting, based on a completely different rationale of what it was about. Now, my argument right from the beginning was that time was in the movement, but the purpose was not to be able to predict events. That is, Ellen White has very strict counsel about time setting. And I didn't believe that we could set aside her counsel in the way that Parminder had. But I did believe that time was in our movement. It had already been put there, and that the purpose of it then was to correct us in some way. Exactly what that would be, I did not know, but that was the idea, is that this had to do with the movement itself. And if that was witnessed to by external events, that would be different than predicting external events. That is, it wasn't so much that we were predicting something to happen on July 18, 2020, though they had attached Ellen White's vision about what was going to happen to Nashville to that date. And we could see a lot of the symbols attached to that. But that didn't mean that the event had to occur. And then when I found that the event was on a line of failed predictions, and I suggested to Jeff that possibly the prediction will fail, there was really no response from Jeff in that regard. That is, he basically said, "I'll look at your stuff," but he never addressed it. And I thought he would, right? So July 18th came. Jeff had never discussed any of the things that I had presented about July 18th being on a line of failed predictions. And so when it failed, I mean, I was not certain that it would fail. I mean, I thought it's possible that it could occur still. But when it did fail, at least I had an answer of why it failed. Now that was going to be rejected. My answer was going to be rejected by FFA, which I wasn't really sure why. But now I understand more why. And why is it that FFA rejected my arguments regarding July 18th? What is the basic underlying reason, not the surface reason that they would give? What is it that FFA doesn't want to have happen? What is it that they're trying to stop from happening?
They don't want any input from any other source.
Right. So they want to have control over the movement, right? If they would accept my arguments for the failure of July 18, 2020, that would take away their power, right? In their minds. Doesn't mean it really would, but you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's easy to look back on this and sort of, see what was happening. At the time, I mean, I didn't have any, imaginings about what FFA was doing or why. I tend to take people as they present themselves. I don't try to read between the lines. But I could see that what was happening was irrational. And normally when people are acting irrationally, it's because there's a lot of emotion involved, right? Those two, emotions and reason, generally don't coincide, especially certain types of emotions. So I was very puzzled, at their decisions, why they would approach things the way that they did. But I've learned from experience that people don't always act rationally, and that emotions can get the better of them. And I've seen that with people like Bronwyn and others, that, things were always, there's always a lot of drama, heightened emotion, and it's never really a good thing. I've dealt with, self-supporting work. I was at Silver Hills for 2 years. And the one thing I can say about Silver Hills is emotion never, ever came to play in any decision that they made. And in FFA, emotion seemed to be involved in every decision. And that was, to me, sort of one of those signs, it was a sign of a type of immaturity and inexperience in understanding how to run a school, that they were reacting to imagined crises all of the time. And so after being at Silver Hills for 2 years and seeing a very sober and sort of dispassionate approach to problems, where really Silver Hills was like living in heaven compared to being at the School of the Prophets. It's just, the contrast was pretty striking. So what we see happening in this conflict, then we have to say, well, what is this marriage about? What are these promises? So he's going to promise that to David that he gets to marry Merab, but instead he just gets to marry Michael. Now, we sometimes look at the meanings of names, and I think these would be important. Sometimes we look at the numbers, the Hebrew number itself. So Merab, so 4764 means to increase from 7231, rabab, properly to cast together, that is, increase, especially in number, to multiply. Okay, increase, right? But then Michael, which is one who is like God, right? It's the same as the Archangel Michael. It's a little bit different spelling or whatever, but means the same thing, 4324. Apparently the same as 4323, which is properly a container, that is a streamlet or a brook. So here they say it's actually like a rivulet. So in this case, they're not having it the same as Michael, which I've seen. That's Strong's. I know I've looked this up before because we've talked about it before. So here, Brown Drivers Briggs say, who is like God, right? So they have a different definition. So daughter of King Saul, sister of Jonathan, wife of King David, and mother of 5, given to David his wife for the bride price of 100 Philistine foreskins, while still married to David. Her father gave her in marriage to another, Phaltiel. At the death of Saul, David forced her to return. Right? So there's a whole story dealing with that. So that's Brown Drivers Briggs' definition. Now they say it's apparently related to, just as Strong's does, to the word mikal, which is properly a container. So it doesn't seem to be congruent in mind. But anyway, we got Merab, which means like to multiply or to increase, as by multiplication. And then we have Michael, one who is like God, but also this other meaning. So who is like God, which either that's like a challenge, seems more like who is like God as a question. They don't put a question there, whether it's one who is like God or whether it's a challenge, I'm not sure. So the question is, how does that relate? Is there some way in which this has to do with how FFA relates to July 18, 2020, that there are promises made and then those promises are revoked? Now, it could just simply refer to, so July 18, 2020 is going to be presented first in 2018, in November of 2018. And Jeff's going to pick it up, right? He's going to accept July 18, 2020 is valid. He's going to do presentations on it himself, right? He's going to have some of the young people at the school do presentations on it, the 391.5 and July 18, 2020. But we know that Tess is going to step in and put an end to that. Now, Jeff still believes July 18, 2020, but he has to set it aside. And so when the conflict with Parminder's group comes to a head, Jeff then is going to pick up again July 18, 2020. So maybe that's just what that marriage would represent, first with Merab and then with Michael. And then we know that Michael is eventually put away by David. So I'm not sure how we would relate that, how we would understand this. Now, normally we have a woman representing a church or a movement. So, but in this case, that may not be how we look at these symbols. Any thoughts about any of that rambling? Stephen.
When did David?
Okay, Stephen. We'll have Stephen first.
Yeah,
Stephen?
I'm not aware of David putting away Micah. Now, when
Well, she gets married, he sends her back, right? Isn't that what happens? Or does, when it says David forced to return what to him? Is like, that's what I'm trying to.
I'm thinking of a time when, I think it was around the time of Absalom, or maybe not as late as that, but there's a time when someone else goes with Micah, and then she returns to David,
Okay,
and
so then she okay.
he's sort of falling on very sad, and then he says, depart, fear off, sort of thing, and he leaves.
Yeah.
So I think his heart is to sort of keep with Micah.
Yeah, so that's in First Samuel 25. It says Saul also had given Michal his daughter David's wife to Phalti, son of Laish, which is of Galam, right? So we have that, and then in 2 Samuel, it's going to be so 2 Samuel chapter 3, dealing with Ishbosheth. David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Deliver me my wife Michal, which I espoused to me for 100 foreskins of the Philistines." And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, even from Phaltiel, the son of Laish. And her husband went along with her along, weeping behind her, to Bahurim, and said, "Abner, go unto him, go return." And he returned. Okay, so we haven't looked at that story yet. We'll get there someday. But so I guess that's what it means. He forced her to return. I was interpreting that as he put her away, but he gets her to forces her to return to him. So whatever that means. So anyway, we don't know what this means yet, right? We just have these symbols of Merib and Michal. We don't know how we're going to apply them. But, generally we have a woman represent a church or a movement, right? Religious movement or something. But I don't know if that's what we would do in this case.
Can I turn on my camera?
Yeah, you can turn on your camera.
I'll begin.
Why? Okay. So any thoughts about this story at this point? Because I know it's not completed, right? We don't know what this is about, right? Like I don't anyway. Maybe you guys do. How would we fit this story in with our lines? Is there any way that we can fit it in?
There's several different elements in this that we have to consider.
Okay.
Now, as you were covering 1822, we have Saul commanding his servants, saying, "Commune with David secretly." Right?
Yeah.
Is the Hebrew word that's used for secretly implying witchcraft, implying an incantation to bewitch David?
Yes. Yeah. So the word lat, lamed, and tet are the Hebrew letters there. Now, the idea is properly it means muffled.
Okay.
But also to cast or wrap up. Okay, so it can mean secrecy, mystery, enchantment, secrecy or secretly, mystery, and enchantment. So with the Strong's definition, let me just take a look at that. So properly covered, that is secret by implication, incantation. Also secretly or verbally, covertly, enchantment, privily, secretly, softly. So the idea that it's a type, it would be a bad type of secretly, basically. I mean, we could just say, it's done secretly, privately, right? But the idea here is, in when we look at it in our lines, is that there is a deceit behind what Saul is doing, right?
That I'm agreeing with.
Yeah. So, exactly how we would apply that in our lines, where that would be, I don't know.
Well, okay. First, he has his servants speaking to David, saying that the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee.
Yeah.
Did Abner love David at that
No.
time?
No.
So Saul is having them lie on his behalf.
Yeah.
Now we know that he wants David to become his son-in-law. Why? He wants
Well,
David to be close to him. Isn't that the case?
yeah. 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 Keep your friends close. Keep your enemies closer.
Right. So in 23, Saul's servants spake these words into the ears of David, and David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? Now, David at this point, this is after the situation with Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
David may still be in his teens, and Saul is now saying, I want you for a son-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, we were made aware that Saul wanted David close because he could see that God was leading him.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted David's protection because he felt that, hey, my armor bearer is being led of God. Therefore, if he's being led of God, God's not going to let anything nasty happen to him. So I'll be protected. Is that logical?
Well, it's in Saul's mind, it's sort of logical.
Okay.
But he's also going to put David out there to be killed. So he's obviously not rational.
Right. Now, so the servants come back. They are still, excuse me, they are still Saul's servants. They are not David's friends.
Yeah.
And they come back and say, on this manner spake David. So David is saying, why do I deserve this honor? I'm a poor man. I don't have a way of paying a dowry for my wife.
Mm-hmm.
So Saul tells his servants, the king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Saul doesn't have the guts to say this to David. He has his servants say it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when Israel left his father's tents and came to his uncle Laban, Laban made the deal with him on the 7 years for Rachel's hand, right?
Yeah.
But Saul doesn't have that kind of backbone. David typifies that lack of backbone later in the situation with Uriah, because he doesn't say to Uriah, go to the front lines. He sends a message with Uriah to his commanders, telling him to put Uriah on the front line and then withdraw.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, when we get to that story and we start looking at David later on, like right now in this story, we have David representing God's leadership. David himself later on is going to be symbolizing other things within the movement.
Correct.
Right. So just to make that clear.
But in this,
yeah. So in this situation, he's still representing July 18th and God's leading in the movement.
Okay. Now, Saul says to his servants, thus say ye to David. Proof that Saul is not talking to David about this. The king, speaking of himself in the third person, desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So here Saul is being very duplicitous, right?
Yeah.
He has a hidden purpose that he does not want to reveal.
Mm-hmm.
And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Now, what does it mean that the days were not expired? The days were not fulfilled. What are we saying here? What's the Hebrew idiom for?
Well, I mean, the idea is they're not full. The days are not full, but I mean, are you asking where we would apply that in our line? What are the days that are not expired in our line? Or,
Yes.
well, the time is not yet? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
Okay. Because, here we are in the Hebrew, there's lo malah or lo malay.
Yeah, low just means not.
I know.
Malay, expired. Yeah.
So since this request had not been completed, we're then coming down to the next verse, 27. Wherefore David arose and went he and his men and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins and gave them in full tale to the king. So here again.
Yeah, tail referring to tally, like a tally in number.
Okay, but it's the same word, malah, as expired.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because they both mean full. So the time is not full, and then they're going to use that word full in. So it's just Hebrew doesn't have a lot of words.
Okay.
But I think it's significant that it is the same word.
I agree.
Yeah.
So David is now paying the dowry,
Yeah.
being requested to become the king's son-in-law. He's not paying it in full, he's paying it doubled.
Yeah. Okay, so just one thing about this. So we know that we can take symbols and represent them as days. Now,
Okay.
can 100 foreskins represent 100 days?
Possibly.
Right. I mean, we know we have that 100 days of prayer from March 27th, 2020 to July 4th, 2020. That's 144,000 minutes, right? So the symbol of the 144,000. But if we took this 200 and just said, well, that's another 100 days, maybe that there's some significance there. I haven't done any calculation, but we count that brings us to like October 12th, 2020.
Is July 18, is that not the 200th day of the year?
Yeah, I think you probably are correct. Yeah, it depends whether it's a leap year or not, right? But in just a regular, so in a leap year, in the year 2020, it's going to be the 200th day of the year. Normally July 19th would be the 200th day of the year, right? In a non-leap year, but 2020 was a leap year. So yeah, so July 18th was the 200th day of the year. So that might be something that we would look at.
What was July 18th on a biblical year? What number of days was that?
Well, that year?
Yeah.
Let me see. Well, it's the 26th day of the fourth month. So you would just simply 59 plus 30. Yeah, it's going to be like the 115th day of the year on the biblical calendar. But yeah, it's the 200th day of the year on the Gregorian calendar that year. So
That's interesting.
maybe there's something to do with it. Yeah. The 100th day of the year in a leap year is April 9th. So I don't know if that's significant or not. But we do have the 100 days of prayer, and then we have the 200th day of the year, July 18th. So I think that's pretty significant. Thanks for that, Stephen.
The 9th day of the fourth month, and the siege is over.
Yeah, so April 4th being the 9th day of the fourth month on our calendar is the day that the siege ends in the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. Right. So it's going to be on the 9th of Tammuz that the siege ends, and then on the 10th of Av that the temple is going to be destroyed in 586. Right. So, okay. Yeah. So some symbols here, just addressing that the chronology, basically. So I guess the question that I have still has to do with, because I can't read Jeff's mind, but I do think in some ways that Jeff acted irrationally when he adopted July 18th in the way that he did, that it was an act of desperation. And a lot of it just had to do with all of the stuff happening around him. And you can sort of understand it. I mean, he's going to have these different reports, from Bronwyn about what happened, when she was there in Germany, um, and my view at the time was that Jeff was not like he was just responding because I'd seen it happen before. He just responds to the reports that he receives without a thorough examination. Doesn't mean that bad things weren't happening, but it's not the way that I believe that we should approach those types of situations. Like he sort of had got himself in that situation in the first place by appointing Parminder as the leader of the movement, which was, I'm not really sure what Jeff was trying to do, other than he wanted to retire, but he didn't want the movement to go the direction it was going. So he pulls it back into his control again. Yeah, there's just so much I don't know about people's motives. But so he adopts July 18, 2020, but he said this more recently that he didn't, even though he adopted July 18, 2020, I can't remember the words he said, but basically he didn't really have any confidence in me. Like it wasn't about me. He still, that's why I'm not asked to do any speaking. Though they did do this thing where they had me edit the all of these articles that they were going to put on their web page, none of which they used, and that really puzzled me. So they asked me to take care of the web page as far as all of the content. Clayton was going to put it up, and the way that I wanted the web page to work, which I thought was the most rational way to do it, is to have basically a table of contents at the beginning, and you just click on the table of contents, and it will go to the various articles. They all be on one page. And obviously, I believed all of the links to the sources should be on there. And they just had, Clayton kind of surprised me because it was really not a very good web page. I mean, he could have made a worse one, but and then just the content was not, I don't know. And then they just pulled me off of that project without even telling me about it. So, I mean, I was still working on it for quite a while after I was already off the project. So nobody ever told me, oh, we don't want you to do this now. So how long it was that they had pulled me off the project and I was still working on it, I'm not quite sure, but maybe a month. It just, there just was a lot of stuff going on that didn't make any sense. Dwight, you have any thoughts about any of that?
Not really. I mean, the situation at that time, I was involved making telephone calls to parties regarding July 18th. I had some interaction with Clayton,
Mm-hmm.
but no interaction really with Jeff. It was an odd way that things were being handled.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and so I mean, we know there's always lots of secrecy with Parminder's group, and that seemed to spill over into FFA as well.
yeah, very much like an incantation, yes.
Yeah. So traps were being set, and maybe that was part of it. Is and I don't know. Like I always hate guessing at what people are thinking, but at some point, that if it didn't happen, they wanted to have a scapegoat.
Well, is July 18th the 200 foreskins?
Well, that's what it seems like. It's the 200th day of the year. And that's pretty convenient for us in the sense that it happens to be a leap year in which that July 18, 2020 occurs, and it's only in a leap year that it's the 200th day of the year. So I would say that, that's a 1 in 1,561 chance that 200 is going to line up with July 18th. Like we get a number and it lines up with July 18th. I guess it's less. Well, depends how you calculate the odds, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a 1 in 4 chance that you're going to have a year in which July 18th is the 200th day of the year. But the fact that we get this number 200 and it happens to be July 18, 2020 is, not very likely. So, and we're discussing July 18, 2020 in this context. So it seems pretty obvious that that's what it is. So that means that there, in a sense, is a trap there for David being the champion to July 18 being the champion earlier. But in this story, it's unveiling kind of what's behind Saul's involvement with David with July 18th. So FFA has taken up July 18th, right? But yet they don't want to be responsible if it fails. And that might explain a little bit more. It's irrational, right? The reason, why don't they want to understand July 18th? So one of the things that frustrated me was that the movement had adopted July 18th, but I never saw a proper presentation of July 18th in that period from November 9th to July 18th. We saw a lot of and I'm not saying what Stephen and Odilio did was wrong. They dealt a lot with the symbols and so forth of the numbers, but that wasn't how we arrived at July 18th. That's just an analysis after the fact about, the unlikeliness of July 18, just that it's design, right? But the reason for July 18 was never really discussed, right? They're not doing presentations on, Revelation 9 and Ezekiel and going through all of those arguments that led to the July 18th date in the first place, which was really needed to understand its significance. And so when it fails, the people who are following July 18th don't have a basis to evaluate the disappointment, right? Does that make sense? And there's lots of other things too. I mean, even the whole thing of time setting, the way that I understood why we had time in the first place, that's not going to be presented to the movement. In a sense, the movement is still utilizing Parminder's arguments for time setting, which I think were faulty. That is, even though they give some lip service about dispensationalism in regard to Parminder dealing with the Sabbath, that there's not going to be a Sunday law. They don't address the dispensationalism that's connected with his time setting, right? So to me, these were major flaws, major deficits in the presentation that was being made. And then in the material that I provided for the website really addressed these deficits, but they didn't want to use that material. And maybe they thought it was too complex. That's kind of what I thought at the time. Well, these arguments are too difficult for people. But, we had, 252 days from November 9th to July 18th to go through these things. And of course, I did videos myself on it, but, were people in the movement watching these videos? Were they understanding it? And most people just depended on what came from FFA. So a lot of the studies that were being given, especially the ones by Daniel Fontenot, I thought were actually quite damaging to the movement. the way that he was addressing symbolic use of numbers and the topics that he was studying. They could have been, we could have used that time to study our actual arguments for July 18. So I think that's where we would say that's sort of the sorcery, right? If you want to use that word, enchantments that are being used, right? Everything is not as open as the day. And it should have been. People need to be able to make a decision based upon correct information. And I didn't see that happening. So I had a lot of concerns about what was going on at the time. But, it's not my movement. I'm not in control of it. So, whatever happens, they made those decisions. But then they try to blame me for their decisions, which I didn't think was wise. Okay, and any final thoughts before we close with prayer?
None yet.
Okay. So we'll come back to this tomorrow. But there's some good questions, there are some good thoughts, and I think we're starting to make sense out of this. Okay, well, let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we are so grateful again for the time that we can spend each morning, and I'm thankful for the way that your Holy Spirit speaks to our hearts and guides and directs us. We know, Lord, that there's so much that we need to learn, and so much in our characters that don't reflect you. So we just ask, Lord, that we can walk with you today, that we can hear your voice, and that we can do the things that you ask. Be with each person. May your angels watch over them. And may you bring us together to study your word according to thy will. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.